A life saved. Dr. Benjamin Foster's hands were steady as he held the scalpel, cutting with precision, each movement deliberate and measured. The faint beeping of the machines, the sterile scent of antiseptic in the air. It was all too familiar. His world was made of life and death moments like these. But this one felt different. This one felt heavier. In front of him lay a girl, no older than 7, her small body battered and broken from the accident that had almost taken her life. Tasha. He didn't know her last name, but that didn't matter in this moment. All that mattered was the struggle happening in front of him, and the desperate need to save her. Benjamin had been a surgeon for nearly 40 years, the weight of countless lives saved and lost pressed into the depths of his memory. His hands were worn, the skin weathered from years of performing surgeries, but they still had the strength and precision needed to do the job. He had seen children much younger than Tasha come in with injuries far worse than hers and survive. But this was different. The damage to her lungs was catastrophic, the internal bleeding severe, and the pressure on her chest made it hard for her to breathe. Without immediate intervention, she wouldn't last long. Her heart rate's dropping. One of his nurses, Carla, murmured, her face pale as she worked quickly to administer the necessary medications. "We can't lose her, Dr. Foster." Benjamin nodded grimly. "I know. Keep the pressure on her wound. I'm going in." He gave her one last look, then turned his full attention to the girl on the table. The rhythm of his hands, the flow of the instruments, all of it was a part of him now, ingrained into his being after so many years. But still, there was something about Tasha. Maybe it was the way she had looked when they brought her in, wide eyes filled with pain, the unmistakable panic in them as she fought for air. Or perhaps it was the frailness of her little body, the reminder of just how precious and fragile life could be. As Benjamin made the incision, the operating room around him seemed to vanish. The world narrowed to only what he needed to do, what he had to do. The sharp focus was both comforting and suffocating. This was the world he knew, cold, clinical, yet filled with purpose. His world had been full of blood and sweat, of life teetering on the edge of death. And today was no different. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the room filled with the frantic noise of machines and the beeping of monitors, Benjamin's thoughts began to drift. The weight of time pressed on him. He was 63 now, a seasoned surgeon, but one who had begun to question whether he had done enough. Could he really make a difference in the world anymore? His wife, Melinda, had passed away years ago, and the silence of his home had begun to feel like a reflection of his own soul. The hours he had spent at the hospital, the long surgeries, the successes and failures, it all felt distant. But right here, right now, in this moment, he was still needed. He had a job to do. With each precise movement, Benjamin carefully repaired the damage to Tasha's lungs, his mind blank, but his focus sharp. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he worked, the pressure mounting with each passing second. He couldn't afford to lose her. Not today. Not after all the work he put into saving lives. "Her vitals are stabilizing," Carla said, her voice a mix of disbelief and relief. Benjamin looked at the monitor, his heart racing with cautious optimism. Tasha's heart rate, once erratic, was now slowing, becoming steady. The small rise and fall of her chest, though shallow, was a sign that she was beginning to breathe on her own. "It's not over yet," he reminded her, wiping his brow with the back of his gloved hand. "Stay with me, Tasha." The next hour was a blur of meticulous care. Benjamin continued to patch up the internal damage, checking her vitals every few seconds. Slowly but surely, her condition began to improve. The bleeding stopped, and the rise and fall of her chest became a little more pronounced. Benjamin's heart steadied as well. The battle wasn't over, but he could feel it shifting in their favor. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stepped back from the operating table and removed his gloves. He looked at the girl in front of him, her tiny body, still unconscious but now stable. He had done it. He had saved her. Benjamin let out a long, deep breath. It was always this way after surgery, the relief, the exhaustion. But with Tasha, there was something more, something he couldn't quite place. Dr. Foster. Carla's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to her. "She's alive, Carla," Benjamin said, his voice hoarse. "We're not out of the woods yet, but she's alive." The words felt like a weight lifting off his chest, but still, there was a sense of unfinished business. He had done what he could for Tasha, but what about her parents? What about the life she would lead after this? They had saved her body, but how would they save her soul? The hospital lobby was filled with anxious family members, waiting to hear news of their loved ones. But there, sitting in the front row, were Tasha's parents. Her mother, a woman with deep-set eyes filled with worry. Her father, silent and stiff, both clinging to each other as they waited for any word. Benjamin approached them cautiously, his hand still trembling from the intensity of the surgery. It was moments like these that made all the stress worth it. The look on their faces as they tried to prepare themselves for the worst, only to hear that their daughter was alive. "Tasha is stable," Benjamin said, his voice soft but filled with confidence. "She's not out of danger yet, but she's made it through the worst of it. We'll keep monitoring her closely." The mother burst into tears, her body shaking with relief, while the father took a deep breath and nodded solemnly. They had been through a nightmare, but the light at the end of the tunnel was now within reach. "Thank you," the mother whispered. "Thank you for saving my baby." Benjamin nodded, his heart swelling with a deep, almost unfamiliar sense of pride. He had done it. He had saved a life. But more than that, he had given this family back something they thought they had lost forever. He had given them hope. As Benjamin walked away from them, his mind began to drift again. Tasha, the girl who had fought so fiercely for her life, would soon wake up, and the story of her survival would be one for the books. But that wasn't what haunted him. What haunted him was the strange, inexplicable feeling he had when he looked at her, a sense of recognition that he couldn't shake. He had saved many lives, but there was something about her that was different. And as the days passed, Benjamin found himself wondering, had he truly saved her, or had he simply played a part in something far greater than either of them could understand? Tasha remained in the hospital for several days after the surgery, slowly regaining consciousness and strength. Her parents were by her side every moment, their gratitude overflowing. They sent Benjamin a note, thanking him profusely for his care, but he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of disconnect. He had saved Tasha's life, yes, but he felt like he was missing something. Something important. The hospital had moved on to the next crisis. The patients came and went, surgeries were performed, and lives were saved. It was all in a day's work for Dr. Benjamin Foster, but Tasha's face, the image of her tiny, bruised body lying in his operating room, haunted him long after the surgery was over. Years passed. The memories of Tasha faded as life moved forward, but one question remained. What had really happened that night? Why did she feel so familiar to him? Was there more to their connection than just the fact that he had saved her life? It would take years for Benjamin to realize the answer, and by the time Tasha knocked on his door again, he would understand that the journey they were about to take together was one that neither of them could have ever imagined. Time passes, memories fade. Years passed. Dr. Benjamin Foster's life moved forward in a gentle, almost predictable rhythm. The hospital, once the place where he spent every waking moment, had become a distant memory. He had retired quietly after decades of service, leaving behind a legacy of saved lives and unspoken sacrifices. The pressure, the endless hours of surgeries, and the stressful weight of life or death decisions, those days were now far behind him. Now Benjamin's world was much smaller. His house, tucked away on the edge of town, was quiet, the garden his only companion. It was a modest home, with an old porch swing and a flower bed that Melinda, his late wife, had once lovingly tended to. Melinda had passed away 5 years ago, her battle with cancer quick and unforgiving. leaving Benjamin to fend for himself in a silence he had never before known. The house felt empty without her gentle presence. Every room was filled with memories of laughter and warmth, now reduced to a hollow echo of what had been. Benjamin had tried to adjust. He kept himself busy with small tasks around the house, gardening, reading, and occasionally meeting friends for coffee. But nothing truly filled the void. He would sit on the porch, watching the birds flutter by, and think of the years he had spent in the operating room, the lives he had saved. But now, it all felt so distant, like something that belonged to another lifetime. His friends would occasionally call, asking him how he was doing, but Benjamin was always careful with his answers. He didn't want to burden anyone with his loneliness. He was a man who had spent his life helping others, yet now, in his retirement, he found himself at a loss for how to help himself. Sometimes, in the stillness of the evening, his thoughts would wander back to the day he saved Tasha. The image of her small face, pale and bruised, would drift into his mind. And for a moment, it would feel as though she was still there, in his operating room, fighting for her life. He had never seen her again after that day. Her parents had moved away, and though he had tried to find them, his efforts had been in vain. Her life, once so intricately tied to his, had slipped away into the distance, and with it, the feeling of purpose he had once carried so strongly. Yet Tasha lingered in his thoughts. There was something about her, something that had always felt different. He couldn't explain it, but he often found himself wondering what became of the little girl whose life he had saved. How had she grown? What kind of person had she become? Was she happy? Did she remember him? But time, as it always did, pushed those thoughts aside. Days turned into months, months into years. The memories of his medical career slowly faded into a blur, and Benjamin became more and more entrenched in his solitary life. One warm autumn afternoon, as Benjamin was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee in his hands, he noticed something unusual. A movement at the edge of his yard, a shadow in the periphery. He looked up, squinting against the golden light of the setting sun. For a moment, he thought it might be a neighbor, perhaps someone coming to borrow tools or ask for help with something. But as the figure stepped forward, Benjamin's heart stilled. It was a woman. She was walking toward his front door, her figure partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. She looked lost, uncertain, and yet there was something about her that felt familiar. Benjamin's breath caught in his throat. There was no mistaking it now. She was coming toward him. And though he couldn't fully see her face yet, he knew with an unsettling certainty who it was. Tasha. He had never imagined that this moment would come, that the little girl he had saved all those years ago would suddenly appear on his doorstep as an adult. His heart pounded as he stood up, the warmth of the coffee forgotten. He set the mug down on the porch railing and took a tentative step forward, his mind racing. What was she doing here? What had brought her to him after all this time? She reached his doorstep and stopped. There was a brief hesitation, a moment where it seemed she might turn away. But then she knocked softly on the door. Benjamin's hands trembled as he reached for the doorknob. He had seen thousands of patients in his career, and each one had left an impression on him. But none had ever come back like this. None had ever returned after so many years, knocking on his door as if fate had brought them together once more. He opened the door, and there she stood. Tasha was taller now, a woman in her early 20s, but there was no mistaking the familiar features of the little girl he had once saved. Her face was framed by thick, curly hair, and her eyes, those same dark, expressive eyes, still held the same depth, the same quiet intensity. Yet there was something else in her gaze now, something different. Dr. Foster. Her voice was tentative, unsure, as if she wasn't quite sure whether he would remember her. Benjamin's heart skipped a beat. Tasha. His voice cracked with disbelief. It was her, the girl he had saved all those years ago, the girl who had become part of his past, a past he thought he had left behind. I'm sorry to disturb you, she said, glancing down at her hands, which fidgeted nervously at her sides. "I know it's been a long time, but I needed to see you." Benjamin stood frozen in the doorway, his mind reeling. He had expected many things in his life, but this was beyond anything he had ever anticipated. "Tasha," he finally breathed, still processing the sight of her. You're alive. I can't believe it. What brings you here?" Tasha took a deep breath, lifting her gaze to meet his. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something I've been carrying with me for years, something I can't explain, something I need your help with." Benjamin nodded, his instincts as a doctor kicking in. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "Come in, please. We had a lot to catch up on." Tasha hesitated for a moment before stepping across the threshold, her footsteps soft against the floorboards. As she entered, she glanced around the room, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings of Benjamin's modest home. She took in the furniture, the photographs on the walls, the small potted plants by the window. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. Benjamin closed the door behind her, his mind swirling with questions. He had so many, too many to ask all at once. But the one that loomed largest in his mind was the same one that had been with him all these years. "What happened to you, Tasha?" She seemed to sense his unspoken question and met his gaze. "I know it must be a lot to take in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I've come back because I need to understand something that has haunted me for a long time." Benjamin motioned to the small living room, urging her to sit. She hesitated again, but eventually took a seat on the worn couch. He sat across from her, studying her face, trying to discern the emotions hidden behind her calm exterior. Tasha had changed, of course. She was no longer the frightened, small child he had saved. She was an adult now, but there was a quiet intensity to her that reminded him of that day, of the girl who had clung to life with every breath she could muster. "I've been carrying this memory with me," she began, her voice unsteady. "And I know it sounds crazy, but when I woke up that night in the hospital, I didn't just recover. Something else happened, something I don't fully understand." Benjamin leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What do you mean?" Tasha met his gaze, and in her eyes, Benjamin saw something he hadn't expected, something ancient, almost otherworldly. "I don't know how to explain it," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I think I saw something when I was unconscious, something that connected me to you, Dr. Foster, something I can't shake." Benjamin's breath caught in his throat. A connection. Could there be something more to their meeting all those years ago than simple fate? Tasha's voice grew quieter as she continued. "I need to understand what happened that night, and I need your help to do that." Benjamin sat back, his heart pounding with anticipation. He hadn't realized it before, but now he understood. The journey that had begun with Tasha's miraculous recovery was far from over. It was only just beginning. And whatever the truth was, it was going to change both of their lives forever. Unraveling the past. The quiet in the room stretched between them, broken only by the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner of Benjamin's living room. Tasha sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes flickering with an emotion Benjamin couldn't quite place. It was as if the words she wanted to say were tangled up in some deep, hidden truth, something she couldn't fully grasp, something she didn't understand herself. Benjamin leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees, the old aches in his joints forgotten in the intensity of the moment. He had been a man of science for his entire life, a man who trusted facts and evidence, who had relied on the sharp edge of his intellect to guide him through the most chaotic moments in his career. But as he looked at Tasha, sitting there with the same wide, searching eyes he had seen years ago, he felt a sense of unease that he couldn't explain. "What happened that night, Tasha?" he asked softly, his voice gentle but laced with curiosity. "When you were unconscious, you said you saw something. What exactly did you see?" Tasha's gaze dropped to the floor, her brow furrowing, as if the memory was something she couldn't quite touch. She seemed to be gathering her thoughts, piecing together a story she had carried in silence for so many years. "I don't remember everything clearly," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like it's hidden somewhere in the back of my mind, a dream I can't reach. But there are flashes, fragments that come to me in my sleep, like pieces of a puzzle I can't fit together." Benjamin listened intently, his heart beating a little faster. He could see how difficult this was for her. Tasha's whole life had been overshadowed by that night in the hospital. He had saved her body, but now, as she sat in front of him, he realized that perhaps there had been more to the event than he had ever realized, something that had lingered in the depths of her consciousness, waiting to be uncovered. "Take your time," Benjamin said, his voice steady. "What can you remember?" Tasha's eyes closed for a moment, as if she were reliving the memory. When she spoke again, her words came slowly, like a hesitant confession. "I remember the light," she said, her voice distant. "A bright light, almost blinding. I was floating, or hovering. And there were voices, so many voices, all speaking at once. They were comforting, but also distant, like they were coming from far away." Benjamin's mind raced. This sounded like the descriptions people gave when they spoke of near-death experiences, those moments when life seemed to slip away, and the body lingered between life and death. Could Tasha have had a near-death experience? But she hadn't been close to dying, not in the way most people were during a heart attack or serious trauma. He had fixed her body with precision. Her survival hadn't seemed like a miracle, it had been a medical certainty. Or so he had thought. The voices, Benjamin pressed gently. What were they saying? Tasha's lips trembled as she tried to recall the words. I couldn't understand them, not fully. But there was one voice that stood out. It wasn't like the others. It was clearer, stronger, and it kept telling me something important. It kept saying, "You're not alone. You were chosen." The word sent a chill down Benjamin's spine. Chosen. It was a word that carried weight, that held significance. What could it mean? He had always thought of his work in the hospital as a series of decisions, a set of skills applied to save lives. But now, with Tasha sitting in front of him, telling him she had been chosen, something felt different. "You're not alone," he repeated, his voice thoughtful. "Chosen." Tasha nodded, her eyes focused now, her hands gripping the edge of the couch as if the memory was threatening to overwhelm her. "I don't know what it means, Dr. Foster. I've tried to ignore it for years, push it away. But lately, the dreams, these flashes, they'd been getting stronger. They're pulling me back to that moment. I have to know what it means. I have to understand." Benjamin's mind was racing, torn between skepticism and an almost desperate need to understand what Tasha was going through. As a doctor, he had treated many patients with psychological trauma, many who had survived near-death experiences. But nothing about this felt like a typical recovery. Tasha's account didn't match the usual stories. Her recovery had been physically miraculous, yes, but it seemed as if something else had taken place. Something Benjamin couldn't explain, even with all his years of expertise. "What do you think it means, Tasha?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Do you believe it's something more than a dream? More than a memory?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with an intensity that made Benjamin uneasy. "I don't know. But every time I close my eyes, it's like I can hear that voice again. And it's always saying the same thing. You were chosen." Benjamin sat back, his mind churning. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the fear that clung to her words. And yet, beneath it all, there was something else, a yearning, a deep desire for answers that she couldn't find on her own. Benjamin had spent his life searching for answers, solving problems with reason and logic. But this was different. This wasn't something that could be explained away by medicine or science. "Have you tried to find out more?" he asked, his voice calm, though his mind was anything but. "Is there anyone else you've spoken to about this? someone who might understand what you're going through. Tasha shook her head slowly. I've tried. I've seen therapists, even spiritual healers, but no one can explain what I'm experiencing. It's like they think I'm crazy, but I'm not, Dr. Foster. I know what I heard. I know what I felt. Benjamin paused, taking a deep breath. He had always believed that logic could explain everything, that there was always a medical reason for every symptom, a rational answer for every problem. But this defied explanation. Still, there was one thing he knew for certain. He couldn't ignore the pain in Tasha's voice, the desperation that fueled her words. Let's try something, Benjamin said suddenly, surprising even himself with his decision. I don't know what happened to you, Tasha, but I want to help you find out. I want to help you understand what you're feeling. There has to be a reason, and if there is, we'll figure it out together. Tasha looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, as if a weight had lifted from her shoulders, she nodded. You'll help me. Benjamin smiled gently, despite the uncertainty that still gnawed at him. I will, but we need to take this one step at a time. We'll start by going back to the hospital. Maybe we missed something that could explain what you're experiencing. Maybe there's something in your medical records, something from the night you were brought in. Tasha's eyes lit up with hope, a spark of something Benjamin hadn't seen in her before. It was the first time he saw her as more than the scared little girl in the operating room. This was a woman on a mission, driven by a need to uncover the truth, no matter where it took her. I don't know if that will help, she said, her voice quieter now, but determined. But I have to try. Benjamin nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the journey ahead. He didn't know what they were about to uncover, but one thing was certain. This story was far from over. And whatever the truth was, it was waiting for them in the past. Together, they would search for the answers that had eluded them for so long. Benjamin spent the following day preparing, his thoughts consumed by Tasha's story. He knew this wasn't a simple matter. He wasn't dealing with a physical illness that could be easily diagnosed. No, this was something deeper, something that touched on the very fabric of Tasha's being. As he drove to the hospital, he felt a mix of anticipation and dread. The hospital had changed over the years, but the walls still held the echoes of countless lives saved and lost. And somewhere in the archives of those old records, there was a story that might hold the key to understanding what had happened to Tasha all those years ago. Tasha was waiting for him when he arrived. She stood near the entrance, her expression a mixture of uncertainty and hope. But there was something else too, a flicker of something far more powerful than either of them could explain. They walked into the hospital together, side by side, ready to face whatever the past had in store for them. But neither of them could have predicted the revelations that would follow. The truth was out there, but finding it would mean confronting the shadows of their past and the secrets that had been buried for far too long. The search for truth. The hospital loomed in front of them, its familiar white walls towering against the sky. Time had transformed its exterior, with newer wings and updates that reflected the advances in medical technology. But to Benjamin, it still held the weight of his many years spent within its sterile halls. He had entered these doors countless times, a young man with ambition and skill, a surgeon committed to saving lives. Now, as he stood at the threshold once again, he felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and unease. The hospital had once been his world, but today it felt like a foreign place. Tasha walked beside him, her steps cautious, her face a mixture of determination and apprehension. It had been so long since she had set foot here, 15 years, to be exact. And the memories of that night, when she had been rushed into the emergency room, were still vivid in her mind. She had never returned to this place, not until now. But something inside her, something deep and unshakable, told her that this was where the answers lay. They walked through the automatic doors, the familiar hum of hospital machinery, and the soft murmur of voices greeting them. Benjamin's presence was still recognized by the staff, and they greeted him with respect, offering nods and smiles. Some even paused to ask about his retirement, their voices filled with a mixture of fondness and curiosity. "Dr. Foster," one nurse called, "we didn't expect to see you back here. Is everything okay?" Benjamin returned the smile, but his eyes were focused on the task at hand. "I'm here for something important," he replied. "Could you direct me to the medical records department? I need to pull up some old files from 15 years ago." The nurse nodded, sensing the gravity of the request in his tone. "Of course, Dr. Foster. Right down this hall, third door on the left." Benjamin nodded his thanks and led Tasha down the hallway. Tasha glanced around as they walked, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings with a mixture of trepidation and longing. The walls, the white floors, the sterile scent, it all brought her back to that night, when she had been lying unconscious, struggling for her life, unsure of whether she would ever wake up. As they arrived at the records department, the door opened to reveal a quiet room filled with rows of shelves and filing cabinets. The space smelled faintly of paper and ink, a comforting scent to Benjamin, though he knew the task ahead would be far from comforting. "Good to see you, Dr. Foster," a middle-aged woman behind the desk greeted them. She had short, graying hair and glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. "What can I do for you today?" Benjamin approached her, pulling out his ID badge. "I need access to the records of a patient from 15 years ago," he explained. "Her name is Tasha Wells. She was brought in after a serious trauma, and I performed the surgery that saved her life." The woman's eyes flickered with recognition as she typed Tasha's name into the computer. "Ah, I remember that case. It was a big deal back then. Your work was impressive, Dr. Foster. Let me pull up the files for you." Tasha stayed quiet beside him, her hands clasped together as she watched the woman work. She had never seen her own medical records, never understood exactly what had happened during the chaotic hours in the emergency room. She had heard the stories from her parents, how they had feared for her life, how the doctors had worked tirelessly to save her, but she had never fully understood the depth of it. Now, as they stood in the records room, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread, as if the truth, whatever it was just out of her reach. The woman behind the desk tapped a few keys on the keyboard, and soon a thick file appeared in front of them. She slid it across the counter to Benjamin. "Here it is. Tasha Wells. Trauma patient, multiple fractures, internal bleeding. You were the attending surgeon, Dr. Foster. Everything looks to be in order." Benjamin nodded, thanking her before carefully taking the file in his hands. It felt heavier than he had expected, as though it contained not just medical notes, but pieces of a puzzle that had yet to be solved. He motioned for Tasha to follow him, and they moved to a nearby table where they could go through the records privately. Tasha sat down beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What exactly are we looking for?" she asked, her voice shaky. Benjamin opened the file, scanning the pages one by one. The medical records were detailed, as expected. They listed every injury, every procedure, every medication administered. But as Benjamin read through the notes, he found nothing that struck him as unusual. There were no strange anomalies, no unexplained events, just a standard account of the surgery and recovery process. But then he turned to the final pages of the file. As he read through the discharge notes, a small handwritten note at the bottom of the page caught his eye. It was written in a hurried scrawl, as though the writer had been rushing to document something important before it slipped their mind. He read the note aloud. Patient reported feeling disconnected during the procedure, described experiencing a sense of floating outside of her body, hearing voices. No physical explanation found. Patient was stabilized and released without any further complications. Tasha's eyes widened as she listened. Her heart seemed to skip a beat. "Voices?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt that. I heard them too, but I thought it was just a dream." Benjamin's hand trembled as he placed the file back on the table. This was no coincidence. The mention of voices, something Tasha had described in vivid detail, was right there, written in the medical notes. But there was more. The note described a sense of floating outside her body, a sensation that could be linked to the near-death experiences that many patients reported after surviving traumatic events. It seemed impossible, but this document confirmed that Tasha's experience wasn't just in her mind. "It's in the records," Benjamin said, his voice heavy with realization. "You weren't imagining it, Tasha. You really did experience something. Something we don't fully understand." Tasha looked at him, her eyes searching his face for an explanation. "But what does it mean? Why did I hear voices? Why did I feel like I was floating? What is this disconnection they're talking about?" Benjamin didn't have an answer. The voices, the sensation of floating, the strange feeling of being disconnected from her own body, these were all phenomena that science had a hard time explaining. He had always believed that science could answer everything, that there was a logical reason for every mystery. But this defied logic, and yet the medical records confirmed that something extraordinary had happened to Tasha during her recovery, something that no one had ever truly understood. "I don't know," Benjamin admitted, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "But we're not done here. This is only the beginning. There's something more, something deeper, and I think you're right. Whatever happened that night, it's not just a dream. It's real." Tasha sat back, her mind spinning with the implications of what they had just uncovered. The truth was elusive, always just out of reach. But now, she felt as though the pieces were finally starting to fall into place. The voices she had heard, the sense of floating, the feeling of being chosen, they were all part of something far bigger than she could comprehend, something that had been waiting for her to discover. Benjamin stood up, his mind racing with new questions. "We need to find out more. There must be something else, something in the records, something in the hospital archives. Maybe there's someone we can talk to who remembers more about that night." Tasha nodded, her resolve strengthening. "Let's keep looking. I have to know the truth. I have to know what happened to me." As they left the records room and walked deeper into the hospital, Benjamin couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something monumental. What had happened to Tasha all those years ago, and how was it connected to her strange experiences now? They were about to uncover something far beyond the boundaries of medicine, and neither of them could fully comprehend where it would lead. But one thing was clear: they were both about to discover that the truth was far stranger and more extraordinary than either of them could have imagined. The unveiling of secrets. The hospital felt eerily quiet as Benjamin and Tasha made their way deeper into its labyrinthine corridors. The sterile scent of disinfectant hung thick in the air. But it was the silence that unsettled Benjamin most. The usual hum of machines and soft murmur of voices seemed distant, as if they were walking through a place untouched by time. Yet this place held the ghosts of memories, some good, some bad, that seemed to cling to the walls just out of reach. As they passed through the long hallways, Tasha's mind raced. Everything felt so surreal. The file in her hands had shattered what little certainty she had left. The voices, the floating sensation, the very things she had questioned in the years following her near-death experience, were now documented in black and white. They were real, but the implications were still unclear. "Where are we going?" Tasha asked, her voice breaking the silence. Benjamin glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "We're going to the hospital's archive. If there's anything more about your case, anything that might shed light on what happened, we'll find it there." Tasha nodded, but doubt still lingered. She had no idea what they would uncover. She had no idea if this search would even bring them closer to the truth. But deep down, she knew there was no turning back now. The archive room was tucked away at the back of the hospital, hidden from most patients and visitors. It was a quiet, dimly lit room with rows upon rows of old files, yellowed with age, and shelves stacked with forgotten records. The walls were lined with dusty cabinets, and the only sounds were the soft shuffle of footsteps and the occasional creak of wood. When they entered, the air felt thick with the weight of history, and Benjamin couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was waiting for them in this forgotten corner of the hospital. He had never needed to visit this place before. Everything he needed was always readily available through modern digital systems. But today, the archive felt like a place of hidden truths, a repository of answers that had long been buried. "Do you know where to start?" Tasha asked, looking around at the sea of files. Benjamin nodded, though his own sense of uncertainty was growing. "We'll begin with your case," he said, walking over to a nearby shelf. "The records from 15 years ago are likely kept in physical format here. If we're lucky, we'll find something that wasn't included in your medical files." Tasha followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined that this moment would come, standing in a dusty archive room, trying to piece together fragments of a past she could barely comprehend. After several minutes of searching, Benjamin pulled a thick file from one of the shelves. The label on the file was faded, but it read, "Wells, Tasha, trauma patient, 2009. A chill ran down Tasha's spine as she looked at the file. She had been a nameless, faceless entry in a system at that time. But now, she was holding her own past in her hands. He carefully opened the file, his eyes scanning the pages. The first few pages seemed like a carbon copy of the ones in the records they had already seen. Descriptions of her injuries, her vitals, and the surgeries she had undergone. Everything seemed routine, until Benjamin reached the final set of notes. There, written in the same scrawl as before, was another note from the attending physician. Patient exhibited unusual brain activity during surgery. Electrical scans showed an anomaly. Interference in normal neural pathways. Unknown cause. Reported experiencing dissociation, sensory detachment from the physical body. Suggests possible spiritual or psychic event. Recommended follow-up for unexplained psychological effects. Benjamin's eyes widened as he read the note again. Spiritual or psychic event. He shook his head, unsure if he had read that correctly. "This wasn't in your medical records, Tasha. None of this was ever reported to you." Tasha's fingers clenched around the edge of the file. "Psychic? That doesn't make any sense. What could that even mean?" Benjamin's mind was racing. The phrase spiritual or psychic event was not one he had ever encountered in his decades of practice. It sounded more like something out of a science fiction novel than a medical diagnosis. But here it was, written in black ink on the page. Tasha was looking at him with wide eyes, desperate for an explanation. "What are they trying to say?" "That I was... what?" "That I was chosen because of something supernatural." Benjamin took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. "I don't know, but we need to find out more. There's something here, something that we're not seeing. This anomaly in your brain activity, the sensation of floating, the voices, it's all connected, but we don't have enough information yet to understand what's happening." Tasha shook her head, her frustration mounting. "You're telling me my brain was acting differently, that I experienced something I can't explain. And you have no idea what it means." Benjamin's voice softened. "I'm not saying we don't have answers. I'm saying we need to dig deeper. This isn't just about your physical recovery anymore. There's something else at play here, Tasha. Something that goes beyond the medical explanations." The weight of his words hung in the air. Tasha's mind was spinning. She had lived her life thinking of that night as an accident, a brush with death, and a strange experience that was just the result of trauma. But now, the more they uncovered, the more it seemed as if there was something intentional, something greater behind it all. "I've never told anyone this," Tasha said suddenly, her voice trembling. "But I used to have dreams. Not just dreams, but visions, visions that felt so real. It wasn't just the voices I heard. I saw things. I saw places I couldn't recognize, people I'd never met. And I kept hearing that same voice, telling me I was special, telling me I had a purpose, but I didn't understand what it meant." Benjamin looked at her, his expression softening. "What kind of visions? What were they like?" Tasha took a deep breath, her mind trying to piece together the fragments of those dreams. They were vivid. So vivid. I was never afraid. Always calm, almost like I was being led somewhere. But there was this one image that kept coming up in every dream. It was an old building with high ceilings, pillars everywhere, and a sense of power. There were symbols on the walls, symbols I didn't recognize, but when I tried to understand them, I couldn't. Benjamin's thoughts were swirling. Could this all be connected? The visions, the feeling of being chosen, the strange medical anomalies, they were all pieces of a puzzle that seemed to defy conventional logic. And yet, they were undeniably real to Tasha. He placed a hand on her shoulder, an unspoken gesture of reassurance. I believe you, Tasha, and I promise we'll find the answers. Whatever this is, it's not just a coincidence, but we need to be careful. We're diving into something unknown here. Tasha nodded, her determination returning. I don't care what it takes. I need to know the truth. I need to understand why this happened to me, and why it's still happening. Benjamin took one last look at the file before closing it gently. There's one more thing I need to do. I need to speak with Dr. Ellis. He was the neurologist on your case back then. If anyone has more insight into this anomaly in your brain activity, it would be him. Tasha's eyes narrowed, a flicker of hope crossing her features. Do you think he knows more? Benjamin nodded slowly. He might. And if he doesn't, we'll go wherever this leads, together. As they stood in the archive, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten patients and untold stories, Benjamin felt the weight of the journey they had just begun. The truth was out there, but it was going to take everything they had to find it. Tasha, for the first time in years, felt as though she was no longer alone in this strange, unexplainable journey. And together, they would uncover a truth that would change everything. But the question remained, would they be prepared for what they would find when the final pieces of the puzzle were revealed? The final revelation. The dim light of the archive room seemed to fade as Benjamin and Tasha left, the weight of their discoveries heavy on their shoulders. The silence between them was palpable, but neither of them spoke as they made their way back through the long corridors of the hospital. Benjamin was lost in thought, trying to piece together everything they had uncovered. Tasha, too, was deep in her own contemplation, replaying the visions she had seen, the voices she had heard, and the medical anomalies that now seemed to hint at something far beyond the physical world. As they stepped outside the hospital into the cool evening air, Tasha looked up at the sky, the vastness of the stars above a stark contrast to the turbulence within her mind. Benjamin glanced at her, his voice softer now, a mixture of resolve and caution in his words. We're getting closer, Tasha, but we need to proceed carefully. There's a line between medicine and the unknown, and we may be crossing it. Tasha nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had already crossed that line the moment she stepped back into this world, a world where the physical and metaphysical collided. The visions, the voices, they were real, and she knew now that she couldn't turn back. We've uncovered more than I ever thought possible, Tasha said, her voice steady, but filled with uncertainty. But I still don't understand. If there's a purpose, a reason for all this, then what is it? Why me? Benjamin stopped walking for a moment, his gaze focused on the ground beneath him. I can't give you those answers yet, but I have a feeling that Dr. Ellis might hold the final piece to the puzzle. He's a brilliant neurologist, and he was the one who first noticed the abnormal brain activity in your scans. He might be able to shed light on what's happening inside you. Tasha's heart skipped a beat. Do you really think he knows something we don't? Benjamin's gaze softened. I believe he might, but we need to be patient. Sometimes the truth takes time to surface. With that, they made their way to Dr. Ellis's office, an imposing building that stood at the edge of the hospital grounds. The stark contrast between the cold, clinical exterior and the warmth that Tasha hoped might be inside was not lost on her. She wasn't sure what she expected when they met Dr. Ellis, but she knew that whatever answers he could provide might change everything. Inside the office, Dr. Ellis was waiting for them, He was an older man, with thick glasses perched on his nose, and a mind that seemed to operate at lightning speed. When he saw Benjamin, a hint of recognition flickered in his eyes, but it was Tasha who captured his full attention. "Well, if it isn't the young woman who defied the odds," Dr. Ellis said, his voice a mix of curiosity and respect. "I didn't think I'd see you again after all these years." Tasha swallowed hard, feeling a sense of both anxiety and anticipation rise in her chest. "I'm here because I need your help, Dr. Ellis. I need to understand what happened to me. What happened when I was in your care all those years ago. There are things I've been experiencing that I can't explain. And now, with the files Benjamin and I found, I think there's something more to my case than anyone realized." Dr. Ellis studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning her face as if searching for something in her expression. Finally, he motioned for them to sit. "You're not the first patient to come to me with unexplainable experiences, Tasha, and I've seen some things in my career that defy logic. But what you're asking about, the brain activity, the dissociation, it's not something I can explain easily." Tasha leaned forward, her voice steady, but full of determination. "I need to know. The record said something about spiritual or psychic events. I don't understand what that means. Was it just a mistake, or could there actually be something to it?" Dr. Ellis sighed, his hands folding together on the desk in front of him. "I remember your case well. The scans we took during your surgery showed some peculiar patterns, ones that I had never seen before in my career. It wasn't just brain trauma or post-surgery effects. There was something more, something that we couldn't quite put our finger on. Your neural activity showed signs of intense disconnection, as if your mind was functioning independently of your body, almost like your consciousness was existing outside of your physical form. And the voices, the sensation of floating. It wasn't a hallucination. But at the time, I couldn't find any scientific explanation for it." Tasha's heart raced as she listened. She had felt it all. The sense of being outside herself, the voices that spoke to her, and the overwhelming sensation that something greater than her body was pulling her towards something. "So what are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm saying that there's more to you than I thought," Dr. Ellis replied, his voice low and serious. "Your brain was functioning in a way that doesn't fit within the current medical understanding. The neural pathways were altered, yes, but it's possible that your mind tapped into something we don't yet comprehend. A realm of existence beyond the physical, perhaps even something that some would call spiritual. I don't know if it's psychic, as the note suggested, but I do believe that whatever happened to you, it wasn't just a random event. There's a reason you were affected in this way." Tasha's mind was spinning. Her whole life, she had tried to make sense of the strange experiences, the visions, the voices, but now, hearing Dr. Ellis's words, it all started to feel more real. There was an explanation. An unexplainable one, perhaps, but it was still a clue, a glimpse into something greater. "I don't know what this means for me," Tasha admitted, her voice trembling. "But I need to understand. What do I do now?" Dr. Ellis hesitated, his fingers tapping on the desk. "There's one more thing I need to show you, Tasha." He stood up, walking over to a cabinet in the corner of the room. "I kept this from you back then because I didn't know how to explain it, but I think you need to see it now." He returned with a small weathered box. Inside, it contained a series of scans, X-rays, MRIs, and other medical images, some of them showing areas of the brain that appeared to be marked with unusual patterns. As Benjamin and Tasha studied the images, a strange and chilling thought occurred to them both. The patterns were deliberate. They were not the result of any accident or injury. They looked almost purposeful. "What does this mean?" Tasha whispered, unable to take her eyes off the scans. Dr. Ellis looked grim. "I believe you were exposed to something, Tasha. Something that altered your mind on a deep level. I can't say for certain what it was, but the changes in your brain, those patterns, they are not natural. You were either chosen, or something in your life was designed to push you down a path that led to this moment. Tasha felt her pulse quicken. You mean, this was no accident? Dr. Ellis nodded slowly, his face grim. No. I believe that you were meant to experience this. But who or what made this happen, I can't say. All I know is that there is something unique about you, something beyond our understanding. The room was silent for a long moment, as Tasha absorbed the gravity of his words. The visions, the voices, the strange disconnection. It was all real. And now, it seemed as though the universe had led her to this moment for a reason. But what that reason was, she still had no idea. Benjamin's voice broke the silence, his words both comforting and filled with uncertainty. So what now? Dr. Ellis gave a long, drawn-out sigh. What happens next is up to you, Tasha. You can continue searching for answers, or you can accept that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. But whatever you choose, you have a rare gift, and it's time you embrace it. Tasha's mind swirled with possibilities, each one more extraordinary than the last. She had once thought of herself as a survivor, a young girl who had beaten the odds. But now, she understood. She wasn't just a survivor. She was part of something far greater, a force that defied explanation. The truth was still out there, hidden just beyond her reach. And she was determined to find it. As she stood up, the weight of her journey ahead settling on her shoulders, she turned to Benjamin. Let's go, Dr. Foster. We have more work to do. Benjamin nodded, a spark of determination lighting up his tired eyes. Wherever this leads, Tasha, we'll face it together. And with that, they stepped out into the unknown, the final revelation just beyond the horizon, waiting for them to uncover the truth that would change their lives and the world forever.